Performing in front of 90,000 people? Easy. But sitting on Jimmy Fallon's couch with no script, no choreography, just raw, unscripted questions flying at you live? That's a whole different war zone. The Tonight Show crew watch BTS behind the scenes, and they notice something most fans never see. Not all 7 handle that pressure the same way. So who grips the armrest tightest when the teleprompter goes dark? Who freezes behind that perfect idol smile? 7 members, 1 list. Let's go. Number 7. RM. And we're kicking off this list with someone who, let's be brutally honest here, probably made every single member of the Tonight Show production crew exhale in relief the moment he walked into that studio. Because if there is one human being on planet Earth who was practically engineered by the universe to sit across from Jimmy Fallon and handle whatever curveball comes his way without breaking a single bead of sweat, it's Kim Namjoon, RM, the leader. The bridge, the guy who essentially became BTS's live English translator, diplomat, spokesperson, and emotional anchor all rolled into one. Not because Big Hit told him to, but because he literally taught himself English by watching Friends on repeat as a teenager in Ilsan, dissecting every joke, every idiom, every slang phrase until the language became second nature. And that's not some cute backstory they throw around in interviews for charm points. That's a real, documented, self-driven obsession with communication that started long before BTS was even a concept on a whiteboard in Bang Si-hyuk's office. The Tonight Show crew noticed it immediately. According to multiple behind-the-scenes accounts from staff who worked the BTS segments, from the Subway series in 2020 to the multiple guest appearances throughout 2021 and beyond, RM was consistently the member who required the least amount of pre-interview briefing. While other members would huddle with their translator reviewing possible question topics, practicing short English phrases, or quietly rehearsing responses in their heads, Namjoon would be the one casually chatting with the sound engineers about New York weather. Not performing calmness, just genuinely deeply calm. And here's the thing that separates RM from every other K-pop idol who speaks decent English. It's not just vocabulary or grammar. It's his ability to think in real time in a second language under studio lights with millions watching and still deliver answers that sound thoughtful, articulate, and unrehearsed in the best way possible. Remember that iconic moment when Jimmy asked BTS about their message to the youth? And without missing a beat, Namjoon delivered a mini speech about self-love and finding your own voice that sounded like it belonged in a TED Talk. That wasn't scripted. The crew confirmed it. That was raw, unfiltered Namjoon, processing the question, connecting it to something meaningful, and articulating it in perfect conversational English within seconds. Most native English speakers can't do that under pressure. He did it in his second language on national American television. But let's go deeper, because the reason RM sits at number 7, the least nervous member on this list, isn't just about language ability. It's about psychology. Namjoon has talked openly in countless V-Lives, Weverse posts, and even in his solo music about how he processes anxiety. He's not someone who pretends pressure doesn't exist. He's talked about imposter syndrome, about the weight of being a leader, about moments where he questioned whether he was good enough. But here's the critical difference. He processes all of that before the camera turns on. By the time he's sitting on the Tonight Show couch, he's already had the internal debate, already confronted the fear, already decided that the best version of himself in that moment is someone who shows up fully present and fully engaged. The crew described him as the easiest celebrity guest to work with during unscripted segments, not because he was robotic or overly professional, but because he had this rare ability to make everyone around him comfortable. He'd ask the crew questions back, he'd compliment the set design, he'd make small talk with Jimmy's band, The Roots, about hip-hop influences. He turned what could have been a nerve-wracking foreign interview into what felt like a living room conversation between friends. And that energy, it was contagious. Multiple crew members noted that the other BTS members visibly relaxed when Namjoon was leading the conversation. He wasn't just managing his own nerves, he was managing the emotional temperature of the entire group. When a question came in that was tricky or unexpected, the other members would instinctively glance at Namjoon and he'd either answer directly or subtly reframe the question in Korean so the others could jump in comfortably. He was running point, playing defense, and somehow still making it all look effortless. That's not a skill you learn in idol training. That's emotional intelligence operating at an elite elite level, sharpened by years of being the guy who had to stand at United Nations podiums and address world leaders about generational trauma. After that, Jimmy Fallon asking, "So what's your favorite thing about New York?" is basically a vacation. So yeah, RM at number 7. Not because he doesn't feel pressure. He absolutely does.
Number 6, J-Hope. Now this one is going to surprise a lot of people because if you've watched even 30 seconds of any BTS interview, anywhere on this planet, your brain has already categorized Jung Ho-suk as the guy who is physically incapable of being nervous. He's J-Hope. He's literally named after hope. The man walks into a room and the room gets brighter. He's the one screaming, "Yeah!" before Jimmy Fallon even finishes the introduction. He's the one whose laugh can be heard 3 studios down. He's the member who turns a basic water drinking moment into a viral meme because his energy is just that magnetic. So how? How does someone like that end up at number 6 on a list about nervousness? Because the Tonight Show crew saw something that the cameras rarely catch. They saw the version of Ho-suk that exists in the 60 seconds before action. And that version is a man doing math, emotional math, energy math, performance math. Let's break this down, because this is where the genius of J-Hope gets wildly underappreciated. Most people think Ho-suk's energy is spontaneous, like he just wakes up vibrating at a frequency that could power a small city and carries that through every waking moment. But the production crew described something far more sophisticated. They noticed that in the minutes leading up to unscripted segments, J-Hope would go through what one crew member called a visible internal ignition sequence. He'd be relatively quiet, not silent, not withdrawn, but noticeably operating at maybe 40% of his usual wattage. He'd be observing, watching the studio layout, noting where the cameras were positioned, listening to the energy of the crew, reading the room the way a DJ reads a crowd before deciding which track to drop. And then, almost like flipping a switch, the moment the segment was about to begin, he'd crank that dial from 40 to 200 in an instant. The smile would widen, the posture would shift, the voice would jump 2 octaves, J-Hope mode would activate, and it was magnificent to watch. But here's the key detail the crew picked up on. That switch, that transition, it's not effortless. It's calculated, and the fact that it's calculated means there's something underneath it that needs to be managed. What the crew observed was that Ho-suk's nervousness doesn't look like nervousness in any traditional sense. He doesn't freeze, he doesn't stutter, he doesn't grip the armrest or avoid eye contact. His nervousness manifests as overperformance. When J-Hope feels the pressure of an unscripted moment, especially in an English language setting where he can't rely on his native tongue to express complex thoughts, he compensates by amplifying his energy output. More laughter, more physical comedy, more exaggerated reactions, more "I'm your hope." It's brilliant, honestly, because it works. The audience loves it, Jimmy loves it. The clips go viral every single time. But the crew, the people standing 3 feet away, off camera, watching the monitor and the real person simultaneously, they could see the micro moments between the bursts. The half second where the smile would flicker, the quick glance toward RM to check if his English response landed correctly, the way he'd tap his thigh under the desk, a self-soothing rhythm that dancers often develop, right before a question was directed specifically to him rather than to the group. And let's talk about the language factor, because this is where J-Hope's slight edge of nervousness becomes most visible. Ho-suk's English has improved dramatically over the years. His solo promotions for Jack in the Box and his Lollapalooza headline set proved he can command an English-speaking audience with confidence. But there's a meaningful difference between performing rehearsed English on a stage where you control the narrative and responding to an unexpected question in real-time conversation where the meaning needs to be precise, nuanced, and immediate. In performance, J-Hope is untouchable. He could perform on the surface of the sun and still hit every mark. But in unscripted dialogue, where you can't choreograph the words, where the rhythm isn't predetermined, where a misunderstood idiom could change the entire meaning of your response, that's where the crew noticed Ho-suk's nervousness would dip just slightly below his usual stratosphere. One specific moment the crew referenced was during a segment where Jimmy asked each member a rapid-fire fire personal question, something spontaneous, not in any prep document. When it got to Hoseok, there was a beat, maybe a full second, which doesn't sound like much, but for someone whose brand is instantaneous, explosive energy, a 1-second pause is the equivalent of anyone else having a full-blown panic attack. He recovered beautifully, threw out a hilarious physical reaction, deflected with charm, and got the audience roaring.
Number 5. Jin. All right, let's talk about the man who turned an entire global career into what appears on the surface to be the most relaxed, most unbothered, most delightfully chaotic late-night interview presence in the history of Korean artists visiting American television. Kim Sek-jin, the eldest, worldwide handsome, the guy who, in the middle of a perfectly serious Tonight Show segment, would casually throw out a dad joke so confidently that Jimmy Fallon, a professional comedian who has been doing this for decades, would genuinely lose composure and break character laughing. That's the Jin the world sees, the Jin who blows kisses to cameras without a shred of irony, the Jin who introduces himself as WWH with the kind of deadpan conviction that makes you believe he's either the most confident man alive or the greatest comedic actor of his generation. And for the first 2 tapings of BTS at The Tonight Show, the production crew believed exactly that. They wrote him off as the easy one, the zero-maintenance member, the guy who needed no pre-segment coaching, no reassurance, no translator hovering nearby for emotional support, because Jin seemed to walk into that studio like he owned the building, the network, and possibly the entire Rockefeller Center complex. But then came the 3rd taping, and that's when one particular crew member, a segment producer who had been working late-night television for over 15 years, noticed something that changed everything. They noticed the pattern. See, here's what makes Jin's nervousness almost impossible to detect if you're not specifically looking for it. His defense mechanism is so entertaining, so charming, so perfectly timed that it doesn't just mask the anxiety, it actively rewards him for being anxious. Let me explain. Most people, when they're nervous in an unscripted interview, exhibit classic tells. They fidget, they give short answers, they defer to someone else, they laugh too much at nothing. Jin does none of that. What Jin does is weaponize comedy. The moment an unscripted question creates even a flicker of internal discomfort, maybe it's a question about emotions, maybe it's a question that requires a complex English answer, maybe it's a question that puts him individually in the spotlight rather than hiding within the group dynamic, Jin deploys a joke. Not a random joke, a perfectly calibrated comedic disruption that simultaneously accomplishes 3 things. It breaks the tension he's feeling internally, it redirects the conversation away from the vulnerable territory the question was heading toward, and it generates such a positive audience reaction that nobody, not Jimmy, not the viewers, not even the other BTS members sitting right next to him, realizes that a dodge just happened. That's not amateur hour. That's elite-level emotional deflection disguised as world-class entertainment. And once the crew recognized the pattern, they couldn't unsee it. They started tracking it across segments. Every time a question got personal, got deep, got emotionally demanding, Jin would intercept it with humor before it could land. Jimmy asks about missing home during long tours. Jin responds with an exaggerated bit about missing his Nintendo Switch more than anything, complete with a dramatic pout that sends the audience into hysterics. The crew laughs, Jimmy laughs, clip goes viral. But the actual question, the one about loneliness, about sacrifice, about the emotional cost of being away from everything familiar for months, that question never got answered. It got entertained away. And Jin was the magician who made it disappear so smoothly that nobody even noticed the trick. Now here's where it gets really interesting from a behind-the-scenes perspective. The crew observed that Jin's pre-segment behavior was markedly different from both RM and J-Hope, where RM was casually conversational with the staff and J-Hope was doing his internal energy calibration. Jin was doing something else entirely. He was workshopping material. Not formally, not with a notebook or anything that obvious, but crew members noticed him testing little jokes and bits on whoever was nearby in the minutes before taping. He'd say something funny to a makeup artist and watch their reaction. He'd try a physical comedy bit, an exaggerated expression, a silly pose, and gauge whether it landed. He was essentially running a micro-comedy set backstage, building a mental arsenal of proven material that he could deploy the moment he needed an escape hatch during the actual interview. That's preparation masquerading as spontaneity. That's anxiety being processed through the filter of performance, and it's genuinely brilliant. But it's also evidence that underneath the worldwide handsome doesn't care what anyone thinks exterior, there is a man who cares deeply, maybe too deeply, about how he comes across, especially in an environment where his limited English puts him at a disadvantage compared to RM, and where the humor he relies on doesn't always translate perfectly across language and cultural barriers. Because here's the thing the crew noticed that most fans might miss. Humor is culturally specific. The dad jokes, the visual gags, the exaggerated confidence plays, those are deeply rooted in Korean variety show culture, where Jin spent years perfecting his comedic timing on shows like Run BTS and various Korean talk shows. In that context, he's a master. The rhythm is natural, the audience expectations are aligned, and the language is his own. But on The Tonight Show, the comedic landscape shifts, the timing is different, the reference points change. An American late-night audience doesn't have the same context for Korean variety humor, which means Jin has to recalibrate his entire comedic instinct in real time, keeping the energy and charm but adjusting the delivery for a completely different cultural framework. And he does it remarkably well. But the crew could see the effort it takes. They could see the half-beat delay where Jin is translating not just language, but comedic logic from one culture to another before delivering the joke. They could see the micro-expression of relief when a joke lands with the American audience, a tiny exhale, a slight relaxation in the shoulders, almost imperceptible, but absolutely present if you're standing close enough and watching carefully. One crew member described it perfectly. Jin is like a swan, beautiful, graceful, looks completely effortless gliding across the water, but underneath the surface, those legs are working overtime. That's number 5. That's Jin, a man whose nervousness is so brilliantly disguised as entertainment that it took a veteran TV producer 3 separate tapings to crack the code. He's not the most nervous on this list by a long shot. His confidence is real, his charisma is genuine, and his ability to command a room is undeniable. But there's an engine running beneath that comedy, an engine fueled by the quiet awareness that without the jokes, without the bits, without the worldwide handsome armor, he'd be sitting in a foreign studio, in a foreign language, being asked to be vulnerable on command. And that's a version of the interview Jin decided the world doesn't get to see. At least not on The Tonight Show. The laughter stays, the depth stays hidden, and the crew figured it out, but they respected it too much to ever break the illusion.
Number 4. Suga. Now we're entering the zone where things start to get really fascinating. Because up until this point, we've talked about members whose nervousness, however subtle, was at least somewhat detectable through behavioral patterns. RM's calm was genuine. J-Hope's energy was strategic. Jin's comedy was a shield. Those are readable signals if you know where to look. But Min Yoongi? Suga? This man gave the Tonight Show production crew an entirely different problem. They couldn't read him at all. And when you can't read someone, when someone's exterior is so perfectly flat, so deliberately minimalist, so aggressively unbothered that you genuinely cannot tell whether they're completely at peace or silently imploding behind those half-closed eyes, that's not calmness, that's a fortress. And fortresses, by definition, exist because there's something inside worth protecting. Let's set the scene, because the crew's experience with Yoongi is genuinely unlike anything else on this list. From the moment BTS arrived at the studio for their Tonight Show segments, 6 of the 7 members would engage with the environment in some visible way, greeting staff, looking around the set, adjusting to the energy of the room. Yoongi would find a spot, usually a chair slightly removed from the main pre-show activity, and just exist there. Not on his phone, not in conversation, not visibly preparing or rehearsing or doing anything that would indicate engagement with the upcoming segment. Just sitting, still, expression neutral, energy flatlined in a way that could be interpreted as supreme Zen-level confidence or complete emotional shutdown. And honestly, the crew couldn't figure out which one it was for the longest time. One audio technician described the experience of miking up Yoongi before a segment as the quietest 60 seconds of my career. Not uncomfortable quiet, not rude quiet, just an absence of the performative social energy that most celebrities, especially idols, tend to project even in behind-the-scenes moments. Yoongi didn't perform off-camera. He didn't turn on charm for the crew. He didn't small talk. He'd give a polite nod, maybe a quiet thank you when the mic was clipped on, and then return to whatever internal universe he was inhabiting. And for a while, the crew genuinely categorized him as the most relaxed member. Case closed. Min Yoongi doesn't get nervous. He's too cool for nervousness. Nervousness looked at Yoongi and got nervous itself. But then they started noticing the hands. It was a camera operator who caught it first, someone whose job requires watching people through a lens with obsessive attention to physical detail. During unscripted segments, when questions were being directed at the group and Yoongi wasn't the one answering, his hands would be doing something. Always doing something. Not dramatic, not obvious, nothing that would register on camera or to a casual observer, but through a tight lens, you could see it. He'd press his thumbnail into the pad of his index finger, slowly, rhythmically, over and over, or he'd adjust his rings, rotating them around his fingers in a pattern that was too consistent to be random fidgeting. It was self-regulation, a physical grounding technique, the kind of thing therapists teach people who experience anxiety, giving your body a small, repetitive task to anchor your nervous system while your mind deals with the stressor. And Yoongi's stressor was specific. It wasn't the cameras. The man has performed at the Grammy stage, produced tracks in studios with some of the biggest names in music, and held solo press conferences for his August D releases with a level of articulate confidence that would make most seasoned artists jealous. Cameras don't scare Min Yoongi. What the crew identified as his specific pressure point was the expectation of spontaneous verbal participation. In Korean interviews, Yoongi has a well-documented communication style. He's concise, deliberate, often witty in a dry and understated way that lands perfectly because his timing in Korean is impeccable. He's the king of the one-liner, the savage comment that comes out of nowhere and destroys the entire room. That's his lane, and in Korean, he drives in that lane like a Formula One champion. But on The Tonight Show, that lane gets rerouted through a language barrier that strips away his greatest weapon, precision. Yoongi's humor, his intelligence, his depth, all of it relies on exact word choice, the right word at the right moment with the right tone. In Korean, he has an infinite toolkit for that. In English, that toolkit shrinks dramatically. And for someone whose entire identity, both as an artist and as a communicator, is built on saying exactly what he means with zero wasted syllables, being in an environment where he can't access that precision is quietly agonizing. The crew noticed that during group answers, when RM was translating, or when the conversation was flowing in English around him, Yoongi's expression would remain perfectly neutral, but his body told a different story. The ring turning would intensify. His posture would shift just slightly, almost imperceptibly, into a more guarded position, shoulders drawing in by millimeters, jaw setting just a fraction tighter.
These are the micro signals of someone who is actively managing discomfort while maintaining an exterior that says, "I'm fine, I'm cool, I'm Min Yoongi, and I don't do stress." And when a question did come directly to him, when Jimmy or a segment prompt required Yoongi specifically to respond, the crew observed something that broke their entire "he's just cool and unbothered" theory permanently. There was a pause. Not RM's confident, thoughtful pause where you can see the answer being composed in real time. Yoongi's pause was different. It was the pause of someone rapidly evaluating options under constraint. Can I answer this in English? Will my English be precise enough to convey what I actually mean? If I answer in Korean, will the translation capture the nuance? Should I go short and safe, or try to say what I really think and risk the meaning getting lost? All of that happening in a 1 to 2 second window behind a face that gives away absolutely nothing. And then he'd respond. Usually short, usually safe, a carefully constructed English phrase that was grammatically fine, but noticeably less sharp, less layered, less Yoongi than what he would have delivered in Korean. And after the answer, the crew caught the tell that sealed it, a micro exhale through the nose, barely visible. But it was there, the release of tension that only exists if tension was being held. That was the crack in the ice wall. Not a dramatic crack, not a meltdown, not anything that would ever show up in a fan-compiled Yoongi nervous moments video on YouTube, but a real human crack, the kind that reminds you that behind the genius Min Suga persona, behind the August D bravado, behind the producer who once said he doesn't care what people think, there is a man who cares deeply about being understood correctly, and the frustration of not having the linguistic tools to be understood on his own terms in real time on live American television, that quietly eats at him in a way he would never ever let the audience see. The crew respected his silence, they respected his process, and they ranked him here at number 4, not because his nervousness is intense, but because it's so masterfully hidden that discovering it felt like finding a secret room in a building you've walked through 100 times. Yoongi doesn't panic, he doesn't crumble. He builds a wall so perfect, so seamless, that his anxiety exists entirely on the other side of it, visible only to those who know exactly which bricks to inspect.
Number 3. Jimin. And just like that, we've crossed into the top 3, the territory where nervousness stops being a background hum and starts becoming something you can almost feel through the screen if you're paying close enough attention. And there is no member of BTS, none, zero, absolutely not a single one, whose nervousness is more beautifully, painfully, magnetically visible than Park Jimin's. Because here's the thing about Jimin that separates him from everyone else we've discussed so far. RM neutralizes his nerves with intellect. J-Hope converts his into energy. Jin buries his under comedy. Suga hides his behind an impenetrable wall of cool. They all have systems. They all have armor. Jimin has none of that. When Park Jimin is nervous, you see it. You feel it. It's right there, in the way his eyes crescent into that devastating smile that somehow gets wider the more uncomfortable he feels. In the way he laughs, that breathy, high-pitched, slightly too frequent laugh that fans have lovingly documented in 1,000 compilation videos, but rarely identified for what it actually is, a real-time nervous response from a man who feels everything at maximum volume and has never quite figured out how to turn the dial down. The Tonight Show crew didn't need 3 tapings to figure Jimin out. They knew within the first 15 minutes of the first encounter, because unlike every other member who had some mechanism to manage or mask their pre-segment anxiety, Jimin's state was immediately legible to anyone with basic human empathy. And here's what made it so striking. It wasn't the nervousness itself that caught their attention, it was the contradiction. Because Park Jimin, on stage, is arguably the most commanding performer in the group. This is the man who performs fake love with a level of emotional intensity that makes grown adults weep in stadium nosebleed seats. The man whose solo dance breaks in Dionysus made choreographers across the industry publicly acknowledge his artistry. The man who moves with such devastating precision and sensuality that entire academic papers have been written about his performance philosophy. That Jimin, stage Jimin, doesn't have a single nervous bone in his body. He is control incarnate. Every muscle fiber answering to a creative vision, so clear, so rehearsed, so deeply internalized that there is zero gap between intention and execution. But take away the choreography, take away the stage, take away the script, the rehearsal, the predetermined structure that tells him exactly where to be and what to do with every second, and replace it with a beige couch, a talk show host asking whatever comes to mind, and a language that isn't his. That's where the other Jimin shows up, the real Jimin. The Jimin the crew fell absolutely in love with because his vulnerability was so genuine, it made the entire studio feel protective of him. Let's get specific, because the details here are everything. The crew noticed that Jimin's nervous behavior followed a remarkably consistent physical pattern across multiple tapings. First, the hands. Not the subtle ring-turning that Suga does. Jimin's hands would find each other, fingers interlacing, then separating, then interlacing again. Sometimes he'd grip his own wrist, sometimes he'd pull at the fabric of his sleeves, bunching the material into his fists in a self-comforting gesture so instinctive it was clearly something he'd been doing since he was long before he was famous. A stylist on set mentioned having to readjust his sleeve cuffs between takes because he'd stretched them out from pulling. That's not a detail you fabricate. That's real, physical, documented anxiety expressing itself through the body. Second, the proximity seeking. The crew noticed that during unscripted segments, Jimin would physically drift toward whichever member was closest to him. Not dramatically, not in a way that would look weird on camera, but there was a gravitational pull, a need to be close enough to another member that he could feel their presence as an anchor. Most often, it was toward RM or Jungkook. If he was seated, he'd lean slightly toward the member next to him, sometimes to the point where their shoulders would touch. It wasn't planned. It wasn't fan service. It was a man instinctively reaching for safety in a situation that made him feel exposed. And that word, exposed, is the key to understanding Jimin's specific relationship with unscripted interview anxiety. Because what scares Jimin isn't the cameras, isn't the audience, it isn't even the English language barrier, although that certainly amplifies things. What scares Jimin is the possibility of being perceived as insufficient. This is a man who has spoken openly in documentaries, in Weverse lives, in the deeply personal lyrics of songs like Filter and Promise, about his lifelong struggle with perfectionism, about never feeling good enough, about the relentless internal voice that tells him he should be better, work harder, give more. In performance, he can satisfy that voice because he can rehearse until perfection is achieved. He can practice a dance move 500 times until his body executes it flawlessly. He can control the outcome. But in an unscripted interview, there is no rehearsal. There is no 500th take. There is only the moment, raw, unfiltered, unrepeatable, and the terrifying possibility that in that moment he might say something wrong, something awkward, something that doesn't represent who he truly is or what he truly means. And for a perfectionist, that possibility isn't just uncomfortable, it's existentially threatening. The crew observed this play out in real time during a segment where Jimmy asked each member to share something personal about another member, a classic late-night bonding exercise designed to be lighthearted and fun. When it was Jimin's turn to speak, his reaction sequence was textbook Jimin. First, the smile widened, not because he was happy, but because smiling is his default stress response, his body's way of performing okayness while his mind races. Then the laugh, breathy, quick, slightly too frequent. Then the glance, always the glance, toward RM seeking either translation support or just the reassurance of eye contact from someone who understands. Then the attempt at an English response, spoken softly, almost tentatively, with a rising intonation at the end of the sentence, as if asking permission for his own words to exist. And finally, if the answer landed, if the audience responded positively, a full-body release of tension so dramatic it was almost comical. Shoulders dropping, hands unclenching, that impossibly beautiful smile transforming from a mask into something genuine. The relief was palpable. You could practically hear his entire nervous system exhale. One crew member, a veteran camera operator who'd shot everyone from A-list Hollywood actors to sitting presidents, said something about Jimin that stuck with the entire team. They said, most celebrities are performing confidence they don't feel. He's performing calmness he doesn't feel. And somehow, the fact that he's failing at it is the most charming thing I've ever seen on this set. And that's the paradox of Jimin at number 3. His nervousness doesn't diminish him. It doesn't make him seem weak or unprepared or professional. It makes him devastating. Because when Park Jimin struggles through an English sentence, smiles through the discomfort, laughs at his own awkwardness, and then somehow delivers a response that is so sincere, so heartfelt, so unmistakably genuine that it cuts through every layer of late-night television artifice, that's more captivating than any polished answer could ever be. The crew didn't just notice Jimin's nervousness, they were moved by it. They said that of all 7 members, Jimin was the one who made the interview feel the most human. Not the most entertaining, not the most professional, the most human. Because he let the audience see what it actually costs to be vulnerable in a language that isn't your own, on a stage you can't choreograph, in front of millions of people whose judgment you've been trained since trainee days to internalize as a measure of your worth. He let them see the shaking hands and the too wide smile and the relief when it was over. And that honesty, in an industry built on polished perfection, that's the bravest thing anyone did on that set.
Number 2, BTS V. This is the one. This is the member that the Tonight Show production crew could not, no matter how many tapings, no matter how many pre-show observations, no matter how many years of collective television experience they brought to the table, predict. Not even once. Because every single member of BTS we've discussed so far, however different their nervous responses are, shares one common trait: consistency. RM is consistently calm. J-Hope consistently converts anxiety into energy. Jin consistently deflects with humor. Suga consistently retreats behind his wall. Jimin consistently wears his heart on his sleeve. You learn their pattern once, and you can anticipate it every time they walk into the studio. Kim Taehyung broke that entire framework. V didn't have a pattern. V was the pattern refusing to exist. And for a production crew whose entire job is to anticipate, manage, and control the flow of a live television segment, that wasn't just unusual, it was genuinely, thrillingly terrifying. Let's start with what the crew expected, because the gap between expectation and reality is where the entire story of Taehyung's Tonight Show experience lives. Before the first taping, the crew had done their homework. They'd watched BTS content, they'd seen the interviews, the variety shows, the behind-the-scenes footage, and based on that research, they had V categorized as the quirky one, the eccentric, the artsy member with the deep voice and the model face who occasionally says something offbeat and charming that goes viral. Simple enough. They figured he'd be somewhere between Jin's comedic energy and Jimin's warm shyness, maybe a little unpredictable but manageable. Within the first 90 seconds of meeting him backstage, that entire profile was destroyed. Because the Taehyung who showed up in the pre-show holding area wasn't quirky, he wasn't charmingly eccentric, he was somewhere else entirely. Not physically. Physically he was right there, standing with the group, dressed immaculately, looking like he just walked off a Celine campaign shoot. But mentally, energetically, emotionally, he was operating on a frequency that the crew could not locate. He wasn't engaging with the pre-show prep the way the others were. He wasn't nervous in any recognizable way. He wasn't calm in any recognizable way either. He was just present in a way that felt both completely there and completely elsewhere simultaneously. One crew member described it as trying to make eye contact with someone who's looking at you, but seeing something behind you that you can't turn around to check. That's not a description of nervousness, that's a description of someone whose internal experience is so different from the expected norm that conventional emotional labels stop applying.
And that's what made V the most nerve-wracking member for the crew, not because he was visibly anxious, but because his unpredictability meant that any unscripted moment could go in literally any direction, and the crew had zero tools to anticipate which direction that would be. Here's a specific example that became legendary among the production staff. During one segment, Jimmy was doing a casual group conversation, loose questions, no strict format, just vibes and banter. The other members were responding within the expected range of idol interview behavior. RM was articulate, Jin was funny, J-Hope was energetic, standard operating procedure. Then Jimmy directed a question toward Taehyung, something simple, something light, the kind of question designed to be a softball that any celebrity can knock out of the park with a quick, charming answer. And Taehyung just looked at Jimmy. Not with confusion, not with panic, not with the processing pause that RM does or the frozen smile that Jimin does. He looked at Jimmy with an expression that can only be described as someone who heard the question, understood the question, but was now internally debating whether to answer the question that was asked or the question he wished had been asked instead. The pause stretched. 1 second. 2 seconds. In live television, 2 seconds of unplanned silence might as well be 2 geological eras. The crew held their breath collectively. The segment producer's hand hovered over the backup plan notes. RM leaned slightly forward, ready to jump in with a translation or a redirect. And then Taehyung answered, but he didn't answer the question Jimmy asked. He answered something adjacent to it, something deeper, something more abstract, something that came from such a genuinely personal and unexpected angle that it momentarily derailed the entire conversational flow into territory nobody had mapped. And here's the wild part. It was beautiful. The answer was strange and off-script and didn't follow any of the unwritten rules of how a celebrity is supposed to respond to a late-night softball question. But it was so authentically Taehyung, so obviously coming from a place of real thought and real feeling that it created a moment of genuine television magic. Jimmy's eyes lit up, the audience leaned in, the other members exchanged glances that contained an entire encyclopedia of, yeah, that's just Tae energy. And the crew who had been holding their breath 2 seconds ago, slowly exhaled and thought, okay, so that's what we're working with. But that same unpredictability that could create magic could also create moments of pure production chaos because Taehyung's nervous response wasn't consistent enough to build a safety net around. Some segments he'd be almost supernaturally relaxed, engaging with Jimmy in English with a confidence that surprised even RM, cracking jokes that landed perfectly, giving the camera's angles so effortlessly photogenic that the director wanted to keep the shot on him permanently. Other segments, sometimes within the same taping, he'd retreat into a quietness so complete that the crew would start running contingency scenarios in real time. The shift could happen mid-conversation, mid-sentence even, and there was no trigger the crew could identify, no specific type of question that consistently activated his withdrawal, no environmental factor that reliably correlated with his mood shifts. It was as if Taehyung's relationship with the interview environment was governed by an internal weather system that only he could feel, and that weather could change from sunny to overcast without any barometric warning. The crew's leading theory, developed over multiple tapings and countless hours of observation, was that Taehyung's nervousness is fundamentally different from every other member's because it isn't really about the interview at all, it's about authenticity. Specifically, it's about the tension between who he's expected to be in that chair and who he actually is in that moment. Most idols, most celebrities in general, have an interview self, a curated version of their personality optimized for public consumption. It's rehearsed, it's safe. Every other BTS member, to varying degrees, can activate that interview self when needed. Taehyung appears to lack the ability, or more accurately, the willingness to do that. When he sits in that chair, what you get is whatever version of Kim Taehyung exists in that exact moment. If he's feeling playful, you get the most charming, electrically charismatic interview guest in the history of the show. If he's feeling introspective, you get long pauses and cryptic answers that sound like poetry fragments. If he's feeling overwhelmed by the lights and the English and the expectation and the sheer foreignness of the entire experience, you get silence. Real silence. Not performative, not dramatic, the silence of someone who simply doesn't have words available for what they're feeling, in any language. And that radical authenticity, that refusal to perform okayness when they don't feel okay, is what made the crew simultaneously terrified and deeply respectful of him. They said Taehyung was the only member that made them feel like they were watching something unmediated, something they weren't supposed to have access to, like the interview was accidentally capturing a private moment that was happening regardless of whether cameras were present. His nervousness wasn't strategic like J-Hope's, it wasn't weaponized like Jin's, it wasn't hidden like Suga's, it wasn't visible like Jimin's. It was atmospheric. It existed as a condition of the space around him, changing the energy of the room, affecting the rhythm of the conversation, pulling the gravity of the segment toward wherever his internal state happened to be orbiting at the moment. And the crew couldn't manage it. They couldn't predict it. They couldn't build a protocol for it. They could only experience it and hope that whatever version of Taehyung showed up that day would choose to share himself with the audience rather than retreat into the beautiful, impenetrable universe that lives behind those impossibly deep eyes.
Number 1. Jungkook. And there it is, the name that just dropped into this list like a thunderclap wrapped in velvet. Jungkook, the golden maknae, the member who can sing, dance, produce, film, edit, paint, do archery, play sports at a semi-professional level, learn any skill in approximately 48 hours, and perform in front of 100,000 screaming human beings with the kind of supernatural poise that makes you genuinely question whether he was manufactured in a laboratory specifically designed to produce the perfect idol. That Jungkook, the one who, by every conceivable metric of talent and achievement, should be the most confident person in any room he enters on any continent at any time. That Jungkook is the member who the Tonight Show production crew unanimously, emphatically, without a moment of debate, identified as the one who gets the most nervous during unscripted interviews. And before you process that, before you reconcile the image of the Jungkook who ripped his shirt open during Fake Love at the Grammy Museum and made the entire internet collectively malfunction with the Jungkook we're about to describe, you need to understand something fundamental about this man. Something the crew understood within minutes of observing him up close, and something that reframes his entire public persona once you see it. Jungkook has spent his entire conscious adult life and most of his adolescence in a system that rewards preparation. He was 15 when he debuted. 15, a child. And from that moment forward, every single public-facing moment of his existence was structured, rehearsed, choreographed, and optimized. Every stage performance, rehearsed hundreds of times. Every music video, directed, scripted, shot from predetermined angles. Every variety show appearance, pre-produced with planned segments and expected talking points. Even the most spontaneous content BTS released, the V-Lives, the Bangtan bombs, the behind-the-scenes footage, existed within a framework where Jungkook knew on some level that he was in a controlled environment, surrounded by people whose job it was to make him look good. He grew up in that structure. He was shaped by it. His confidence, that breathtaking, almost arrogant level of stage presence that makes him one of the most captivating performers alive, was built entirely within the walls of preparation. And the Tonight Show unscripted interview? That's what happens when you remove every single wall simultaneously. No choreo, no script, no predetermined camera angles, no rehearsal, no safety net of Korean language where he can express the full depth and complexity of his thoughts, no structured segment where he knows what's coming next, just a couch, a host, a question he's never heard before, and the expectation that he, Jungkook, international superstar, the guy whose solo single 7 broke every record imaginable, will respond naturally, confidently, and charmingly in his second language on live American television. The crew said the difference between Jungkook backstage and Jungkook on stage was the most dramatic transformation they had ever seen in any artist.
And they meant that literally, not as hyperbole, not as a cute anecdote. They said that in their combined decades of working with musicians, actors, comedians, politicians, and every other category of public figure that cycles through late-night television, they had never seen a gap that wide between someone's performance confidence and their conversational confidence. Backstage, before unscripted segments, Jungkook exhibited what the crew described as textbook high-functioning anxiety. And the word textbook is important here, because his tells weren't subtle or ambiguous like Suga's ring turning or J-Hope's energy calculations. They were clinically recognizable. His hands were the first giveaway, not fidgeting in the casual, restless way that many people fidget, trembling, a fine, persistent tremor in his fingers that he would try to manage by clasping his hands together or shoving them into pockets or holding onto a water bottle with a grip tight enough that the crew noticed the plastic deforming under his fingers. One makeup artist who did touch-ups between segments said they could feel the vibration in his jaw when they worked on his face, a micro-tremor running through his muscles that spoke to a level of adrenaline response usually associated with fight or flight activation, not sitting on a talk show couch. Then there was the rehearsing, and this is the detail that broke the crew's hearts a little bit, because it was so earnest, so effortful, so painfully endearing that several of them mentioned it independently without being prompted. In the minutes before unscripted segments, Jungkook would quietly, almost inaudibly, practice English phrases to himself. Not full sentences, fragments, starts of answers. I think. For me, it's like, my favorite is, he'd whisper them, test them, repeat them with slightly different intonation, trying to pre-build conversational Lego blocks that he could snap together in real time when a question came. He was trying to choreograph a conversation, trying to apply the only framework he'd ever known, rehearsal, repetition, perfection through practice, to an environment that is fundamentally defined by its inability to be rehearsed. And the tragedy of it, the beautiful, gutting tragedy, is that it doesn't work. You can't pre-rehearse spontaneity. You can't choreograph a conversation the way you choreograph a dance break. And Jungkook knew that. The crew could see that he knew that. They could see the frustration layered underneath the anxiety, the understanding that his preparation strategy was insufficient for this particular battlefield, combined with the inability to abandon it because it was the only strategy he had. During the actual segments, Jungkook's nervousness manifested in ways that fans have documented extensively but perhaps never fully understood the depth of. The eyes widening just slightly, the body going momentarily still, the way a prey animal freezes when it detects a predator. Not because Jimmy Fallon is threatening, not because the question was difficult, but because in that microsecond, Jungkook's brain was processing a cascade of competing demands. Understand the English question, formulate a response, translate his Korean thoughts into English words, evaluate whether those words accurately convey his meaning, assess how the pronunciation will sound, worry about grammar, worry about his accent, worry about whether the answer is interesting enough, funny enough, deep enough, all while maintaining the idle perfect exterior that 13 years of training programmed into his DNA. That's not a conversational response. That's a cognitive overload event disguised as a pause. And when he did speak, when the answer finally came, the crew noticed something that distinguishes Jungkook's interview anxiety from everyone else's on this list. His voice changed. Not dramatically, not in a way the television audience would consciously register, but the crew, standing feet away with professional audio equipment, heard it clearly. His speaking voice, already naturally softer and more uncertain than his singing voice, would drop in volume during unscripted English responses, almost as if the words were trying to make themselves smaller, trying to take up less space, trying to minimize the damage radius in case they landed wrong. He'd speak toward RM rather than toward Jimmy or the camera, even when the question was directed specifically to him, seeking the safety of the member who could catch him if he fell, the member who could translate not just his words, but his intentions, the member who had been his linguistic safety net since he was a terrified 15-year-old standing on stages he wasn't emotionally equipped to stand on. And RM, every single time, would be there. A subtle lean in, a small nod, sometimes a quiet Korean word of encouragement that the mics barely picked up. The crew watched this dynamic repeat across every taping and recognized it for what it was, a bond forged not just in friendship or brotherhood, but in the specific crucible of one person consistently protecting another person in their most vulnerable moments. Jungkook's reliance on RM during unscripted English interviews wasn't weakness, it was the scar tissue of a career that started before he was old enough to drive, a career that gave him superhuman skills in every performative domain, but never quite taught him how to sit still and talk without a script and feel okay about it. But right here is where the crew's story takes the turn that elevates this from a simple "he gets nervous" observation to something genuinely profound. Because despite everything, despite the shaking hands and the whispered rehearsals and the voice that tried to make itself smaller and the eyes that searched for RM like a lighthouse in a storm, Jungkook never once asked to skip an unscripted segment, never once requested that questions be pre-screened or softened, never once asked for the safety modifications that would have been immediately granted if he'd simply said the word. He showed up, every time, trembling hands and all. He sat in that chair, faced the questions he couldn't prepare for, spoke in a language that made him feel exposed and insufficient, and did it anyway. Not because he wasn't scared, but because Jungkook, the kid who moved to Seoul alone at 13, who cried in practice rooms, who trained until his body gave out and trained some more, has never once in his entire life let fear be the reason he didn't try. The crew said that the most memorable Jungkook moment wasn't a perfectly delivered answer or a funny viral moment. It was a moment that probably didn't even make the final edit. It was after a segment ended, cameras technically rolling but the main conversation wrapped, when Jungkook let out a
And there you have it. 7 members, 7 completely different relationships with the same fear. From RM's unshakable composure at number 7, to J-Hope's brilliantly engineered energy at number 6, to Jin's comedy fortress at number 5, to Suga's invisible ice wall at number 4, to V's heartbreakingly visible warmth at number 3, to V's unpredictable beautiful chaos at number 2, all the way down to Jungkook, the golden maknae whose trembling hands taught an entire production crew what real courage looks like. At number 1, 7 men, 1 couch, no script, in the most honest version of BTS that most fans never get to see. Because here's what the Tonight Show crew ultimately took away from working with this group, and it's something that goes far beyond a nervousness ranking. They said that what makes BTS different, genuinely, fundamentally different from every other artist or celebrity or public figure who has ever walked through those studio doors, isn't their talent. Talent walks through those doors every week. It isn't their fame. Fame is a Tuesday in late-night television. It's the fact that all 7 of them are terrified in different ways, at different volumes, with different coping mechanisms, and not a single one of them lets that terror win. They don't pretend they're not scared. They don't demand the world make it easier for them. They sit down, face the chaos, and give whatever version of themselves they have available in that moment, polished or stumbling, eloquent or silent, laughing or shaking, and somehow, every single time, that's enough. More than enough. That's the thing the crew couldn't stop talking about long after BTS left the building. Not the music, not the choreography, not the screaming fans outside 30 Rock, or the records being broken in real time. It was the quiet, private, unglamorous reality of 7 human beings choosing vulnerability over safety over and over again, in a language that isn't theirs, on a stage they can't control, in front of a world that expects perfection from people who never promised it. They only ever promised to be honest. And on that Tonight Show couch, with no script, no choreography, no safety net, honest is exactly what they were. Every nervous laugh, every shaking hand, every too long pause and too wide smile and whispered English phrase practiced 30 seconds before the cameras rolled. All of it, honest.
all of it, human, all of it, BTS. So the next time you watch an unscripted BTS interview, any show, any language, watch closer. Watch the hands, watch the shoulders, watch the glances they exchange when they think the camera isn't on them, because now you know what's happening beneath the surface. Now you know the cost of every casual answer and every effortless smile. And maybe, just maybe, you'll love them a little more for it. Not for being perfect, for being brave enough not to be.